So hello everyone. This is the first DESCHEDULER meeting this year. We have 4 folks on the deck. There's a code of conduct, so let's be nice to each other and let's start the meeting. We have four items here, but before we start, let's introduce the new release of DESCHEDULER. It's version 0.26. Hurrah! And so there's been a lot of contribution. So thank you everyone who had time and resources to make the DESCHEDULER code better. If you need to know more about the release, please let us know. And thank you, Mike, for being always here, for publishing the releases and telling everyone that we have a new release. All right, so let's start with at this point, I guess the most pressing topic, and it's the descheduling framework. So as you know that in around April the previous year, we started the discussions and created first proof of concept of the descheduling framework. And as of now, we've been able to finally implement the conversion from the old V1 Alpha 1 version to V1 Alpha 2 version, which means that we can actually start using the new V1 Alpha 2 configuration and move forward with implementing the parts which are to be new and specific for the descheduling framework. So just to summarize it where we are so far, we've been able to migrate all the plugins, the strategies into plugins, then implement argument defaulting and validation, and as of today, finally, the PR, which is responsible for the conversion between versions, has been merged. And so where we are now and what we need to do next is that we can start implementing the descheduling cycle. We can have a broader discussion either in the PR or in one of the issues I'm about to create. So that's where we are. What does it mean for us, or what would be the timeline for us to complete the descheduling framework? So in April, there's a KubeCon taking place in Amsterdam, and we would like to present the descheduling framework there, including actually the first introduction of what the descheduler is. So in order to get there, we just basically need to finish implementing the descheduling framework, the descheduling cycle, and provide some examples of the configuration. Then I believe write some documentation on how to actually use it. What are the new elements in the configuration? For example, that we can now specify the same plugin multiple times based on profiles. So that would be like great to make a few examples explaining on how to use it, and make sure that we emphasize the difference between the profiles in the scheduler and in the descheduler. But besides that, I think we are close to actually completing the framework, and once that's done, we can finally integrate all the new feature requests and basically start performance measurements of the descheduling framework. So that's the current state. I think it will be better to share any details like in those issues, because like there's been a lot of going on, and I need to update the issue with all the bits that we have done so far and what's remaining. So I will say that let's just, okay, Lucas, please.
Just one thing that I just remembered, I think I sent a message on the PR, but I also forgot after that. We don't have right now documentation for the V1 Alpha 2. So even though we have it in place, people using the project wouldn't know how to use it. Like, we should add it, right? Even if it's not examples of how to create plugins or use specific plugins, but like how to use V1 Alpha 2.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too, that maybe a separate task as updating our docs to make sure that they all reflect the V1 Alpha 2 config in this next release. Because this is all like the V1 Alpha 2 with the PR that merged today is usable if you set up the config, right? So in V27, the next release, that'll be, we'll be able to put docs out and say people can start using this API, right?
Yeah, I agree, and thanks for mentioning that. Like I think that right now we have a documentation in DroidMe, and that's the only source of truth about the configuration and so on. So we can either extend this and move the V1 Alpha 2 description under a different directory, and then just update like this README with the description on how to use the V1 Alpha 2, or like do you rather prefer to write a separate documentation completely? Because like we have the docs directory here, but I'm not sure if there's like anything specific to V1 Alpha 1 here.
No, yeah, I think just updating the docs that we have to use the format of V1 Alpha 2, because it's a different like format that people will have to celebrate. So if the preferred version is V1 Alpha 2, we should update our docs to just refer to that. And then if people are still on V1 Alpha 1, they can look at the past versions of the docs, I think. So maybe a judgment call that we should make is, are we officially deprecating V1 Alpha 1 at this point, and like saying we're not going to add any new changes to it, any like other features that we come up with will just be put in V1 Alpha 2. I mean, I guess ideally, the point of V1 Alpha 2 is that like it's abstract enough that new features aren't going to specifically change a lot of stuff. But my point being, well, let's just document V1 Alpha 2, update our docs to read that way, and the rest is preserved in the history.
Okay, I agree. Yeah, like by the documentation, I guess to refer to DroidMe, right? We don't have anything else these days. Yeah, so I was like wondering whether we might like introduce actually some official documentation on the Kubernetes website repo, maybe like.
Yeah, I think that would be great if we could. I know that there's some mentions of the descheduler right now, but not really like a
really?
full section on it. So yeah, I think that we could justify having our own section.
Yeah, like I'm not sure whether this is a practice like performed by other community projects, but if not, we might be the first to suggest it maybe.
Yeah, that's true. We could at least set up like a GitHub page to, have the docs parsed a little better, kind of like how like KubeBuilder has one, and it just basically parses GitHub and turns it into a little more readable docs.
Yeah, let me just quickly take a look at it. Oh yeah, like you mean like something like this or?
Yeah, I think this is all. Well, I guess the KubeBuilder book is kind of a separate idea, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head that has it.
External secret separator, we have it's a GitHub pages.
Oh
and
yeah,
it's generated from the repository.
Yeah,
it's using make docs.
All right, that sounds actually great. We might at least start with the GitHub pages, and then we can eventually discuss this with the website owners if they are okay with sharing the documentation there as well, or just there. All right. Sounds good. Yeah, like I wish I had like better status report on where we are and what still needs to be done. But just like mentioning the high level parts here. Mike, Lucas, is there anything else worth sharing about the status of the descheduling framework, or can we move forward?
Next steps, besides the documentation, so
yeah, implement the descheduling loop cycle. That's one of the missing parts. But besides, yeah, and then like of course deciding like whether we are going to run all the deschedule extension point from every profile and then the balance extension points, or if we do it like per profile. But that's still something to be discussed.
One other thing that might be good is if we can try to like collect some of the, or all of the little tech debt things that we've picked up throughout the changes. I don't mean that in like negative. I mean like some of this tech debt is necessary to move on through, but we've made some small little things like to-dos and notes about things that could be refactored. It would be good to have those all, like, even if they're all kind of unrelated, just having them in a single doc of like things that were picked up from the framework migration, so that new contributors or just us as we're going back through and trying to move this along to more stable can have a central spot to see what needs to be updated still.
Yeah, I think that most of those to-do items are either in the to-do comments or through new issues opened, unless there are a few which we omitted, but we might actually go through the latest comments in the PRs and hopefully we will find more, but yeah. And of course, like then once the framework is done, then we definitely need to do some performance measurements to identify which parts of the framework are the slowest one. Because like recently we had a issue where a user was actually mentioning that when the descheduler is run over a cluster with it was like 12,000 pods, then the descheduler was actually consuming a lot of memory resources. So we actually great to see like the memory and CPU consumption as a function of number of pods processed by the descheduler and nodes, of course, and then maybe compare it with the original implementation before we started implementing the descheduling framework. All right. Next topic is the KubeCon talk areas to discuss. So as we discussed earlier, we mentioned that we will give it our first introduction to what the descheduler is, and we then allocate some time for mentioning the descheduling framework, and probably it makes sense to provide a list of the most common use cases where the descheduler is used and some are not for the future. Those might be the main topics, but like if there is any other topic which is worth mentioning and you have in mind, feel free to share it. Or we can, of course, open a Google Doc and collect all the ideas and topics before the conference starts. We have like 3 months of time. Well, assuming that the talk gets accepted, of course. Okay, I take it as that we will discuss this next time or continuously, I guess. All right, then I will give the word to Amir to discuss the remaining 2 topics.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, so my organization has been using DESCHEDULER for about 1.5 years. the strategy that we use the most is the topology spread constraints. Initially, we started with opt-in, and we had a handful of applications that needed to be spread evenly across availability zones. These may have been things that the bottleneck was maybe network, and we wanted to workload to be spread evenly across AZs. But now it's a standard offering as part of our clusters. So every workload is opted into DESCHEDULER. And right now, the way the metrics are, it doesn't have information about our compliance labels. And by compliance labels, we have labels such as which project this pod belongs to, which team owns this pod, and these are like both compliance but also cost center labels that we have on the workload. And we want to be able to show skew per project and per team. We have an SLO that says all projects are spread evenly across availability zones 99.95% of the time in a given month. And we want to know for which projects we breach that SLO. And teams also care about those metrics. I realize that with the metrics that we have today, we can't have that flexibility, right? Those metrics can never graduate to be stable if we inject tags in. But if there was a way in the descheduling framework that we could subscribe to eviction metrics or events, and we have enough information about the pod or the node where we could, as a subscriber, generate our own metric. And then we could inject whatever compliance labels that we needed in those metrics.
Yeah, this, like, the problem makes a ton of sense. I think that it's not a very uncommon thing that people would want to do. My concerns with it are with the proposed approaches that we could take. I think it would be really cool if the descheduler framework does have an extension point to hook into some sort of customizable metrics. My concerns are I don't know of any other projects that do that sort of thing. If there are, it would be really great to have some examples to see how to follow that. Because of issues with, like you were saying, stability and cardinality of metrics that affect performance and compatibility. So I also wonder, have you looked into any sort of like post shipping stage processing, like with like the OpenTelemetry collector or something like that, to try to inject these labels in your processing stage?
Yeah, I didn't know where to start, and whether that means that I need to have like a cache of pods, right? Because by the time the eviction happens, it could be that the pod is gone or something, right? And I might not be able to query the labels that I care about.
Yeah, I think that in that case, there could be a much broader, like, architectural question of like how to deploy deschedulers in this manner that they can be, their evictions can be attributed to different projects, different cost centers, and then inject those labels into whatever sort of telemetry agent you have, like the collector, or if you're shipping it off to Datadog or GCP or something. So I don't feel like we need to like say this is never going to happen, but I would really like to try to do some digging into if there are like other tools or components that have any sort of custom metrics possibility that we could follow, or if not, has anyone asked about this kind of question elsewhere? I imagine that it would be a pretty common thing that people are trying to do, and see what we can learn from other use cases. And if maybe there are some like architectural examples that we could provide for running descheduler among multiple projects. We've never really documented too much on how to do that. So I think trying to invest in that area will help people like your organization and other organizations that are growing and trying to run more than just one descheduler, which has kind of always been our default answer of you just need to have this one. Maybe there are setups that could have either multiple or multiple that are attributing to different projects. So I know it's not really much of an answer, but I think that those are kind of the approaches. And my first approach would be trying to see, has anyone else done something like this?
Mhm.
Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think so. If you all know of any other projects that have run into this, I think that would definitely help the discovery for me. But if not, I can look into, other projects, see how they're approaching this.
Yeah, I think that the question comes down to really like Prometheus. Is this like the kind of pattern that other people have accepted as a acceptable Prometheus approach, or the recommendations that I've found so far seem to kind of advise against it.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something else there. I can ask around some people too, see what people think about having like a custom metric webhook or extension point.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I wonder like to what extent the customization of metrics should go, because I'm not sure like this webhook for metrics works or if that's actually a thing, but by default we need to specify like the every time we want to collect a metric, we need to make a code change, right? So actually we get some data from it, and we decide like which data are recorded into metrics. So it's hard for me to imagine like any like more complex customization of this approach, because like no matter, so like if a descheduler is not publishing a metric for you, I don't see a way how you can actually create a new metric by any kind of customization, but maybe I just don't fully understand the customization or how it works.
The way that I'm imagining it, at least through like using the framework, would be, if you're trying to write a custom descheduler, you're compiling it anyway. So if we have some way to hook into like our metrics registry that we have, and then that handle could be passed to plugins that can then access like their custom defined metrics. Maybe there's something like that we could do.
Oh, so something like a field selector, or the way it works, like did you mention that, like for example, which like known field you would like to collect, and then like the custom metric handler would try to access those fields, maybe?
Well, I'm just thinking in my example, if you have like a descheduler plugin that you want to report a metric about, like you're writing this and you're building it in and you have a metric, maybe we have like an extension point specifically for metrics reporting that you could parse environment variables out of the pod and then attach those to a label and then report that as just like an info metric or something. Maybe there's something that you could get out of that. But I agree with you that customizing these metrics would take some sort of recompiling if you were going to do custom metrics. So I think that that's at least our starting point.
Yeah, like I was taking into account where Amir mentioned at the beginning about reporting the skew of projects or spaces, in which case like you would have to make definitely any code changes. But if the scope of this change would be to only to custom plugins, then I think it's quite okay to create a API for registering new metrics, as long as those new metrics are part of the custom plugins. But otherwise, like like there's
Yeah, and if you're really just trying to add in like skew to metrics that are already being reported, there are setups that you can do, like where you run multiple like collectors each having a different config that parses an environment variable from its deployment that has its SKU in it, or you can just manually inject that, and then maybe you have your descheduler report to a different metrics endpoint. I think that would require running multiple deschedulers. It gets into more about the like metrics collection side, I think, is where this sort of customization could be done without code changes. Otherwise, it will take code changes.
Like we might use just an idea that, but we might actually run a second instance of descheduler in the dry mode with some new flags, which would basically just monitor the current state of your cluster, where you might like, I don't know, like compile it with additional metrics, which would be like presented in a metrics plugin maybe, and you would then basically be able to collect additional metrics about the cluster without changing the functionality of the first instance of the descheduler. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, or you could run your metrics collector as a sidecar in the descheduler itself, so then it has all of the descheduler information. You don't have to recompile anything. It can just use like Kubernetes variables that are shared within the pod. So I think that there are options, and we could dig into this more. And taking a better stance on like running multiple deschedulers and trying to attribute SKUs to them is an area that we should put some more effort into defining.
Yeah, we have like over, I think, 1,500 deployments, mostly unique projects. So having unique deschedulers per deployment probably wouldn't work for us. But I think the ability to enrich the metrics or the events might be an area that I could pursue.
Okay, yeah, so just curious, are you just running, I mean, you're just running one descheduler in your whole cluster? Yeah. Okay, cool. And it's performing well?
It's performing well. The only parts where we have use cases that are coming down the pipeline that like we want to use pod lifetime more than once, right? Because we have a different condition on it, right? But I think profiles is going to achieve that. As far as performance issues, we haven't ran into that yet.
Cool.
We tend to use more clusters than a cluster with 5,000 nodes. So then we have a descheduler per cluster as well. So we haven't really hit that kind of a performance bottleneck yet.
Okay. I didn't want to get off on a tangent. I was just curious, but it is, knowing the scale that you're working at, I think that this really, this is a relevant issue to have with that.
Yep.
Did you, Amir, had a chance to check the memory consumption of the descheduler?
Yeah, I have all that information for the past 12 months. So if it helps, I can share that. We're definitely not using like the default resources. We've definitely tuned it. And we definitely saw a bump after we used informers, or we had to bump the memory significantly, but I can get all those data points, like to say prior to informers, we were using this much. After we started caching pods and nodes, we're using this much. And I can certainly tell you after using the descheduling framework, whether that has any impact or not.
Yeah, that would be really useful too. Okay. I think I've said everything that I had to say. I think we have a couple action items to take off of this too, and it's back at the top of my radar now. It's kind of drifted off, but thank you for bringing it back up, Amir.
Oh yeah,
Right.
this one.
Yep.
Okay. We have been using a single constraint, which is the availability zone. But now we're getting to a point where we say we want to also evenly spread the workload across nodes. And we've observed a lot of eviction loops. And we ended up rolling that change back, only using availability zones. But the minute you have multiple constraints, the scheduler gets into an eviction loop. Now, I don't know if this issue is directly related to that. I don't have a lot of data points at the moment, but what I do know is the remove pods violating topology spread constraint ends up running the loop over the constraint sequentially, meaning that it does all the zones first and then gets to the nodes without ever considering that this pod was a candidate for eviction. Meaning that even in that loop, it could consider a pod for eviction multiple times, or it could not consider that it will be balanced because of the previous constraint eviction. So the first thing to consider is, are we using least eviction for this? I think maybe having some sort of algorithm that says what are the least number of pods that I can evict to be balanced is a good start. And then if we still have the issues, I can dig in and see if there's any other optimization we can make to this strategy.
Yeah, so the goal with this definitely was to get the least number of evictions, but I think you're right that it doesn't consider across constraints in these sort of cases. I'm pretty sure that the code doesn't do that. I don't know, it's been a while since I've dug into it too much, but that's definitely the goal, is to have least number of evictions. So if that's not being achieved in these cases, then we should fix that.
Yeah, I think in the example that I gave, so that first line, the 2 and 1, and then the second one is like your second zone, and it's a 1 and 0. There's definitely like the way to achieve that with the least number of eviction is just evict 1 to get 1 across all the nodes. But right now it's evicting 2. And I want to say it's evicting 2, 1 from the zone constraint and then another 1 for the node constraint.
Okay, yeah, I think I see what you're saying. Yeah, and I was just looking through the code too, and it just loops through each constraint and
Exactly.
tries to move as few as it can for that constraint, but then I'm pretty sure that they all just get added to one list of pods to be evicted.
Exactly.
So yeah, this could be redone. So have you done any work in trying to debug this?
Yeah, I try to take a stab at fixing it. And I did like the quick and dirty fix where I would say, if a pod is already considered for eviction, remove it from the list of topo pair, but that didn't fix it. So I'm definitely going to spend a little bit more time in the coming weeks to see how I can fix it. But I think it's going to be like a big change. And the reason is right now we're looking at each constraint individually. I think we need to start looking at them. Like if a deployment has 3 constraints as part of its topology spread constraints, we need to consider all 3. And that's what, I'm assuming that's what scheduler does, right? It just counts all of those, creates a score, and then says it gets scheduled onto this node, right? But we're looking at these things separately.
Yeah, our problem is kind of like the inverse, and it doesn't map directly to how the scheduler does it, in the way that you have to reverse calculate everything. Versus I think the scheduler's job is a little easier because it can see everything that's out there and pick one that will fit the best. Yeah, I think maybe Yeah, it's right now it's broken down like namespace, topology, and then pods within that topology. Maybe moving the pod check like a level up and looking at all of the topologies on a pod.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. So
Yeah, so I think it'll be doable. It'll be tricky. But yeah, it comes down to those duplicates that we're looking for, right? A pod that matches across constraints. So as long as we can find a way to represent that.
yeah. The other challenge was that if a pod is considered for eviction, you don't want to count it again, right? But the challenge is we think this pod is going to be evicted, but there are additional constraints that we do at the end. Like there's a can evict, right? And there's also max number of pods to evict per node per namespace. And those are not executed during this check. It's happened at the, like we compiled the list of pods to evict, and then we run all those additional checks. So it's not going to be perfect, but I think maybe the first step is to like consider multiple constraints and then come back and say, can we bring all of that logic to this level to see if we can evict and whether we've hit those throttles like max pods per namespace or max pods per node during this check.
Yeah, those extra checks, and I think this is the same for a lot of the strategies too, is that those are always kind of assumed at like the last case. So we kind of just dumbly chop off however many pods or whatever, which can end up, there's been bugs opened about like, I'm always seeing the exact same pods evicted. And I think that there was a request for like a randomized sorting or, which seems more like a Band-Aid on the issue than fixing it itself, which is that we're just doing these at the end. I think that that's a separate issue though. And if we can just, if we can get the base case of this issue solved, those we can revisit across all the different strategies.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll create an issue for the second one.
Yeah, I think that would be good to track.
Right. Seems that we get to the end of the list. Is there anything else you have in mind that would be worth sharing? Or yeah, more or less done sharing? All right, guys, thanks a lot. I guess let's keep any other discussion in those issues so we can keep the context, and I can actually, it's actually quite interesting goal to redesign the topology spread constraint strategy, because that's kind of interesting. Sometimes a bit hard to debug it, but like definitely a challenge. So yeah,
definitely hard to debug it. I can. I've spent hours trying to see why it evicted the way.
It was such a tough strategy to come up with, and I really tried to comment like every single line what I'm doing in it. I think like half the file is comments, but it's still a really weird algorithm.
All right, guys, enjoy the rest of the day and talk to you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.